Welcome. I'm Pastor Anthony Savaggio of the Rochester Christian Reformed Church, and this is another episode of the Bible Bistro. Thanks for coming in and dining today. And our menu is very simple, very short. We have simply two things on the menu at the Bistro, and that is the author and the acrostic. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the book of Lamentations, and I'm setting here kind of a series of introductory videos to a sermon series I'll be preaching later this summer on the book of Lamentations. And so I'm trying to lay that groundwork now, some of the background, the context, literary factors, so that you could better engage with those sermons. And on our menu, as I've said, is the author and the acrostic. So let's start with the author. Now, most people, if you ask them who wrote the book of Lamentations, they will tell you Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. They will attribute authorship to Jeremiah. And the reason for that is that has been the historic, long-held position of the church. Most people will have embraced that understanding. And there's some good reasons for that, why that became the historic position of the church, that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations. And it goes back to the Greek version of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, and it's abbreviated here through the Roman numerals LXX. The Roman numerals for 70. That comes from the tradition, the legend, if you will, the tradition that it was written by 70 scholars, and so LXX stands for the Septuagint, a way to abbreviate it. And this is the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament. And by the way, it's also really the predominant version of the Old Testament used by the New Testament authors. Often in the New Testament, what is being quoted is the Septuagint and not the Hebrew text. And I always tried to use this as an argument with my seminary professors, particularly my Hebrew professor, that, why do I have to learn Hebrew? I mean, the Septuagint was good enough for Paul. It was good enough for me, right? You don't have to, you can use this Greek version of the Old Testament instead. Now, that's not true, but that's not a good idea. But anyhow, that's the argument I made. So, but in the Septuagint, in this Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament, really the predominant version used in the New Testament times, the book of Lamentations is located near Jeremiah. So the two are brought together canonically in close proximity, and there's also an introductory verse in the Septuagint that ascribes authorship to Jeremiah. And here is that verse. Let me read it to you. And it came to pass after Israel had gone into captivity. There's our event, right? Remember, this book, Lamentations, is about the Babylonian captivity, 587 BC. And so this introductory verse, and it came to pass after Israel had gone into captivity and Jerusalem was laid waste, that Jeremiah, there he is, that Jeremiah sat weeping and composed this lament over Jerusalem and said, and then thus begins the book after that. So you have this introductory verse in the Septuagint attributing authorship to Jeremiah, and this becomes the tradition of the church. And you can see it in the King James Version. The King James Version, the title of the book of Lamentations is Lamentations of Jeremiah. And so this took hold in our tradition until about the 18th century, when scholars began to question Jeremiah's authorship of the book of Lamentations. And there were many reasons why this authorship, attributing the book to Jeremiah, was called into question. Some of them were historic reasons, kind of historical facts, archaeological, that kind of stuff. Some of it was language and comparative studies of the language usage of the two books, trying to discern, people tend to use the same type of vocabulary, and there was comparative studies like that. And some of it was about the message of the book and some of the differences. And so, but the main thing, and without going into too much detail, the big one, okay, the killer argument is that the Hebrew text of the Old Testament is anonymous. There is no attribution of authorship in the actual Hebrew text. Now, when you do textual criticism, your goal is to go back and to reconstruct as best as possible the earliest source material, the text, right? And so the Septuagint is a translation, a later translation of the Hebrew text. So it's better to go to the Hebrew text because it's the one that's older, an older tradition, the original language, if you will. And so if we go there to the best text, the best sources we have, it's anonymous. And so that calls into question whether we should be dogmatic or certain about the authorship of Jeremiah when the scripture itself in the original is not, right? It doesn't give us any author at all. So Jeremiah, was he the author of the book? Well, it's plausible. It's possible. But it's not something of which we can be certain about because of the biblical text itself. We don't have enough evidence to be conclusive on that. And the question comes up, does it matter? Well, I mean, I would argue it must not matter because God didn't give it to us, right? God uses human authors as part of the inspiration process. Sometimes they are identified, sometimes they are not. And we can assume when they are not that it's not important for us to really interpret the book. So in some ways, it's not important whether it's Jeremiah or not. The message stands regardless. And so I think that's probably a good way to look at it. But it is plausible it could be Jeremiah. Now, I think there's a very good balanced position that's taken in a commentary on Lamentations by J. Daniel Hayes. And in this commentary, he writes this, and this will be essentially my view and my posture towards the book of Lamentations. This is what he writes. The view of this commentary is that since the Hebrew text is anonymous, the issue of authorship must not have been critically important when the text was written. There you go. Thus, although certainly Jeremiah might have authored it, faith in the inspiration of Scripture does not demand it. He goes on. On the other hand, this commentary places a high interpretive value on the canonical location of Lamentations in the Septuagint and in our English Bibles right after Jeremiah. What is he saying? He's saying something about, there's a thing about canonical theology, right? It kind of matters how the canon is constructed. And the book of Lamentations was placed by Jeremiah in the Septuagint, in our King James Bible, in our English Bible, and that should have some weight in interpretation. He goes on. Lamentations contains numerous allusions and connections to the book of Jeremiah that are important for understanding Lamentations. Thus, Lamentations is best interpreted and understood as a sequel or postscript to Jeremiah. Here, therefore, the book of Jeremiah will be viewed as the context for understanding, preaching, and teaching Lamentations, and that's really how I will approach the text as well of Lamentations, that I will use Jeremiah as the context for understanding, preaching, and teaching Lamentations. You see, it does matter the canonical proximity of the two books, that they are related. I love that idea of it being a sequel to Jeremiah. Perhaps it's the best way of thinking about it. A sequel that may have been written by someone else, but is connected intimately and inextricably to Jeremiah and his story. That's my approach to it. That's the best I can say about author. Could be Jeremiah, may not be. The Hebrew text, the best text, is anonymous. We just don't know. But there is this connection with Jeremiah's work and the prophecy of Jeremiah, and that should be part of our interpretive construct. Okay, so that's the author. Let's talk about the acrostic. What's an acrostic? Well, you know what an acrostic is. It's when you use the letters of an alphabet to order a text. And this is what's happening in the book of Lamentations in some really powerful and interesting ways. So there are 5 poems in the book of Lamentations. There are 5 chapters, 5 poems. Now, chapters 1 through 4 are acrostics. And what that means is there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And each of the verses in those chapters are related to, have that structure where the verse, each verse begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order. And chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 have 22 verses in them, which is interesting according to the Hebrew alphabet. And chapter 3 has 66 verses to it, which is 3 times 22. So there is this acrostic structure in the book of Lamentations. And now you think, well, why do I care about that? What does that tell me? Anything important? Well, it tells you a few things. It tells you that this was carefully constructed by the author. There is literary sophistication here, and you will see that over and over again. It's not just in the structure, it's in the actual vocabulary, the use of various poetic devices, one of which is this acrostic device that's used here. Now, why did they use acrostic devices? Well, there's a couple of arguments why. One is simply could be mnemonic. It could be a memory device, being able to organize and understand and recall to mind the verses of the scripture because you know that they're corresponding to the alphabet of what that you are familiar with. So it could be simply a mnemonic device, a way of memorization. Remember, this is an oral tradition that becomes a written tradition, so it's a way to memorize these things. Also, a second thing is maybe it indicates completeness. You know, we have alpha and omega, right? The sense of the alphabet, the span of this being a way to express a completeness, a totality, and that might be what's going on here as well, that this is meant to be expressing the completeness of this book, the completeness of the story, and of course, it could simply be both of those things, and likely is, both memory and also emphasizing completeness. But the underlying point is this is a sophisticated, carefully constructed text. A lot of work, a lot of thought has gone into this. It's carefully put together. It's not done haphazardly. It is compiled. Each of the poems individually and the compilation as a whole have this integrity, this organization, and this structure. So understanding a little bit about the authorship, particularly how the book relates to Jeremiah, and a little bit about the structure is helpful for us to understand better this book. I hope that helps you, that you're more enlightened about the book of Lamentations so that you'll be able to engage with the preaching as it comes later this summer. Thanks for coming to the Bistro today, for attending, for sampling off the menu. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great day. God bless.